The night of August 15th, 2025, will be remembered across Africa as a night when history shifted. When the old fear that had hung over the Sahel for years finally began to crack. In the Lake Chad region, where countless families have lived in the shadows of violence, a single strike from Niger's Air Force brought down one of the most notorious figures of terror in modern Africa, Boko Haram leader Bakoura. For many, this was not just a military success. It was a moment that carried the weight of justice, sorrow, and a strange kind of relief. People who had grown used to running, hiding, and watching their children grow up with fear in their eyes could finally breathe, even if just a little deeper than before. Bakoura was not just a name. He was a symbol of cruelty, of endless nights of villages burning, of kidnappings that tore young girls away from their mothers, of markets turning into graveyards. His shadow stretched far beyond the borders of Nigeria and Cameroon. For years, his leadership in Boko Haram had turned Lake Chad into a region of nightmares, where people measured life by the rhythm of attacks. The elimination of such a figure is not simply a military statistic. It carries an emotional echo that reaches mothers, fathers, children, soldiers, and leaders who have waited desperately for such a day. The strike itself has been described as flawless, clean, precise, and swift. But behind that word flawless lies something much deeper. It means intelligence officers working tirelessly, pilots risking their lives in the dark, and a nation like Niger stepping forward with courage when many might have hesitated. In a region often painted as helpless in the global imagination, this moment showed strength, resolve, and the determination of Africans to shape their own destiny. When news of Bakoura's death began spreading, the reaction was like a wave rolling. Across the Sahel, some cried tears of joy, others broke down in disbelief. Many remained silent, unsure how to process a reality without the figure who had haunted their lives for so long. In the marketplaces of Niamey, in villages along Lake Chad, even in crowded urban neighborhoods far from the front lines, conversations carried the same sense of amazement. He's gone. Bakoura is gone. That sentence, repeated in different languages and dialects, carried a power that words alone could hardly capture. It is difficult to overstate the psychological weight of this moment. For years, Bakoura and his fighters had cultivated an image of invincibility, spreading the myth that they could not be touched, that their power was ordained, and that resistance was futile. That myth shattered in a single strike. The invincible became mortal. Suddenly, the untouchable was brought down by a nation that refused to bow. This is more than the death of one man, it is the death of an illusion. The tearing away of fear that had been carefully woven into the lives of millions. But alongside relief, there is also reflection. People remember the lives lost before this day arrived. Thousands who were killed in Boko Haram raids, families ripped apart by kidnappings. Entire communities displaced and forced to live as refugees in their own land. The airstrike cannot erase those scars, cannot bring back the children taken, nor the parents buried too soon. Yet it gives a sense that their suffering was not ignored, that justice, even delayed, still has the power to strike back. For the younger generation, this moment may carry the most meaning. African youth, often described as restless and angry with the injustices of their world, they'll see in this act of courage a reflection of their own desire for dignity and freedom. They see Niger taking control of its skies, refusing to let outside powers dictate its battles, and proving that African nations can protect their people. In the classrooms of Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and beyond, young boys and girls will hear about this strike and feel something new: pride, hope, and perhaps a vision of a continent that no longer kneels to terror or foreign manipulation. It is rare to find moments in history where symbolism and action collide so perfectly. The fall of Bakoura was not orchestrated by distant powers, nor claimed by foreign armies. It was an African effort, an African decision, and an African victory. That distinction matters. For too long, the narrative of Africa's wars has been told as if solutions must come from elsewhere, as if Africans are incapable of fighting their own battles. August 15th, 2025, breaks that narrative apart. Still, This is not a simple story of good triumphing over evil in one night. The fight against Boko Haram is far from over. Its networks, its ideology, its fighters, many still remain scattered across the Sahel. Yet even if the fight continues, the strike that ended Bakoura's reign has already shifted the balance. Terror no longer feels untouchable. The myth of invulnerability is broken, and once fear is broken, people begin to dream differently in the quiet corners of Lake Chad. Where fishermen cast their nets and children run along dusty paths, life will not transform overnight. But in their hearts, there is now a story they can hold on to. A story of resilience, of courage, of a night when an African nation stood tall and proved that even the darkest figures can fall. For years, the name Bakoura carried a chilling weight across the Sahel. He was more than just a man. He'd been turned into a symbol of terror, the face of fear that haunted villages, families, and soldiers alike. People whispered his name as if even saying it out loud would invite danger. Boko Haram thrived on this aura, this illusion of being untouchable, and Bakoura embodied that dark myth. But now, with his death, that veil has been torn apart, and the fear that once seemed endless is beginning to dissolve. When news broke that Bakoura had been eliminated in an airstrike, it didn't feel real at first, and he couldn't believe it. After all, for so long he had survived countless operations, slipping away from capture like a shadow in the night. People thought he was invincible, some even saying he had divine protection. But the truth is, he was a man, and like any man, he could fall. And he did. That moment was like watching the walls of a fortress crumble. The myth of Boko Haram's unbreakable strength collapsed in a single strike. For the communities who had lived under the shadow of Boko Haram's terror, this was more than a military victory. The sound of that airstrike was more than just the roar of engines and the thunder of explosives. Many Africans, it was the sound of pride, of ownership, of finally standing up without waiting for someone else to intervene. For so long, people in the Sahel had grown accustomed to hearing about foreign powers swooping in, claiming victories, dictating strategies, and leaving communities feeling like spectators in their own story. But this time was different. This time it was African pilots, African intelligence, African determination that brought Bakoura down. That shift is not just military, it's emotional, it's symbolic, it's deeply personal. When the news spread, many didn't just celebrate the fall of a terrorist leader. They celebrated the fact that their own sons and daughters, in their own uniforms, flying their own aircraft, had carried out the mission. It wasn't another case of waiting for help, waiting for someone else to decide their fate. Taking charge of its destiny, proving to itself and to the world that the continent is not helpless, not dependent, not incapable. That is why this strike resonates far beyond the battlefield. It speaks to something deep in the African spirit. Imagine the feeling of a villager who has lived through raids, through the helplessness of watching foreign powers come and go with promises that never seemed to stick. Now imagine that same villager hearing the words, "Our forces did this, carried out this victory." There's a certain pride that swells in the chest, a feeling of dignity restored. That kind of pride doesn't just heal wounds, it builds resilience. It inspires courage. It strengthens the belief that change is possible from within. For the soldiers who took part, the weight of responsibility must have been immense. They weren't just flying a mission, they were carrying the hopes of millions. And when that mission succeeded, it sent shockwaves not only through the ranks of Boko Haram, but through the hearts of every day. Africans who had grown weary of waiting for miracles. This time, the miracle was homegrown. We often forget how important the psychological side of warfare really is. It's not just about who has the biggest weapons or the most advanced technology. It's about belief in your own ability. To stand, to fight, to win. For too long, narratives have painted Africa as a place that constantly needs saving, as if its people are passengers rather than drivers in their own future. But with this strike, the script flipped. It wasn't a foreign drone, a foreign army, or a foreign government writing this chapter. It was Africa writing its own victory, in bold and undeniable ink. In conversations across markets and tea shops under the shade of old trees, people spoke about the airstrike, not just with relief, but with pride. Our forces did this, they said. Those three words carry power. They remind people that their children who join the military are not pawns in someone else's game, but heroes in their own story. They remind communities that unity and courage can accomplish what once seemed impossible. They remind Africa that its own hands are strong enough to shape its destiny. There's something profoundly emotional about this kind of victory. It's not just tactical, it's soulful. It tells mothers who once feared sending their sons into the military that their sacrifices are not in vain. It tells young people who felt powerless that they are inheriting a continent that is standing taller, stronger, more self-assured. It tells the enemies of peace that Africans will not always wait for outsiders to defend them, that they will rise, and rise powerfully. The strike also rippled far beyond borders. Across the Sahel, in neighboring countries, people watched closely. This wasn't just a Burkina victory, or a Chadian victory, or a Nigerian victory, it was an African victory. It showed that cooperation among African nations is not only possible but powerful. It showed that the spirit of self-reliance, the dream of sovereignty, is not just rhetoric, but reality when people come together. And perhaps the most important thing is what it planted in the minds of ordinary citizens. A new kind of confidence. A belief that their nations are not destined to always be dependent. That their militaries, their intelligence, their courage can shape outcomes that once felt impossible. That belief is transformative. It can change how people see themselves, how they see their government. Hope is a fragile thing, but when it takes root in the hearts of people who have lived through years of fear, it grows into something unshakable. The moment news broke that Bakoura was gone, a wave of emotion rolled across the Sahel, stretching. From small villages tucked deep in the desert to crowded cities alive with restless energy. It wasn't just another headline. It was a spark. A moment that made people lift their heads a little higher, breathe a little easier, and whisper to themselves, maybe this is the turning point. For too long, the people of the Sahel had been told that victory was impossible, that the violence would never end, that Boko Haram was too ruthless to be stopped. Families had lived with the weight of uncertainty, never knowing if tomorrow would bring safety or tragedy. Entire generations were growing up under a shadow of fear. But suddenly, with that single airstrike, the shadow cracked. And through that crack, light poured in. It's hard to describe what pride feels like in these moments unless you've lived through despair. Imagine a farmer who has watched his land raided year after year. Imagine a mother who has had to hush her children to sleep while gunfire echoed in the distance. Imagine a young man who once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but was forced to pick up arms just to survive. For them, this victory was not abstract, it was personal. It felt like justice finally reached their doorstep, like the universe finally remembered their suffering. The pride wasn't just about defeating a man named Bakoura. It was about the fact that Africans themselves had stood up, fought back, and won. This was not a victory handed down from distant powers. It was one forged in the soil of the Sahel by the hands of its own people. That realization stirred something powerful. People began to talk differently, with a new energy in their voices. For the first time in a long while, conversations were filled with possibility instead of only fear. In the marketplaces, women exchanged smiles that carried unspoken words, maybe our children will see peace. In the villages, elders gathered beneath the baobab trees, their weathered faces breaking into cautious but genuine hope. In the cities, young people posted their pride online, declaring that this was proof their nations could defend themselves. Proof that they were not destined to always live under someone else's shield. What makes this moment so profound is that it wasn't just about war, it was about dignity. When you strip away all the politics and all the strategies, what people want most is to feel safe, to live with pride, to believe that their lives matter. And for the people of the Sahel, this strike whispered that message back to them, reminded them that they are not forgotten, that their struggles are not endless, and that they themselves hold the power to change their story, for young people especially. The news hit like a spark in dry grass. Many had grown up believing that their futures were stolen, that no matter what they dreamed, violence would always be waiting around the corner. But suddenly, hope was not just a word. It was a living, breathing reality. It's a pride of knowing their nations were capable of defending themselves, gave them a new kind of confidence. It told them, your dreams are not foolish. You can still build something. You can still become something. Even in the quietest corners of the Sahel, where radio signals are weak and the world feels far away, the story spread. And with it spread, a contagious kind of optimism. People began to picture a tomorrow that didn't look exactly like yesterday. It's astonishing how one moment can carry that kind of weight, how one victory can ripple across borders, across languages, across tribes, uniting people with a shared sense of relief and pride. Of course, everyone knows that one airstrike cannot erase years of pain. The roads are still dangerous, villages still vulnerable, and the struggle far from over. But hope is not about guarantees. It is about possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, people could see those possibilities with their own eyes. They could feel them in the rhythm of their heartbeat, in the way neighbors greeted each other.